we go. So we are in Lent, and we are in the second, we passed the second week. We are now going to be looking at the third week of Lent, which one would think means we're halfway through, but no, when we get to the third Sunday in Lent, we're just beginning the third week. And it's only when we complete the third week that we are halfway through our Lenten journey, which is why the fourth week is the midway point. And when we get to that, that's why we call it Laetare Sunday, and that's why it's the rose-colored vestments, which actually we have a brandy new set, which is just beautiful, and we'll be celebrating. The bishop is coming for visitation. We'll be celebrating confirmation, with our candidates. There's 4 young people being confirmed. And also that evening at Evensong, I got to do my commercials here, that we will be celebrating with Bishop Nichols and Bishop Scanlon from Central Pennsylvania, and the folks from Hope Church in Mount Hope, and also hopefully some folks from All Saints in Hershey, all of which were the principal actors in this project we had called, I get the words all kind of jumbled up here, hope, healing, hope, and I don't know, there are 3 H's anyway. And it's the idea that we collected over $30,000 in this project. And all together with this scheme that we fell into, much at Father Bradley's help in terms of finding this process, the 3 parishes plus the help of the diocese and other contributing parishes, we will have amassed enough money to forgive over $3.4 million of medical debt for people.
Whoa.
So, and they're all in Pennsylvania and mostly in the southeast and south central regions. So, we will really be living up to our commitments relative to our proclamation of Jubilee, that is part of St. Luke's mission. And as we celebrate at St. Luke's, day, and we proclaim the gospel from Luke 4, in terms of actually when the Angelus comes out for March, there's my rector's corner is actually an explanation of that a little bit of how all that works. But more importantly, how this is not just a forgiveness of debt, which is in and of itself a good thing, but how it begins to approach the systemic problem of debt all in all, because many people fall into medical debt, and that causes them to fall into larger problems of debt that they can't get out of. And when then they kind of fall into this cycle, then their lives are really, really sort of tied into this cycle of debt. People, for example, young families that have tried to save up for a down payment on their first house, an unexpected large medical debt, they try to pay that off. They take that savings, they pay off the debt, and they can't really get back into the cycle of saving that much money anymore. And so they never get to the point of being able to purchase a home. Or they fall into vast amounts of credit card debt, or loans at high interest rates and so on. So they get into this cycle of systemic debt. So doing this is more than just simply forgiving a bill. It's breaking the cycle that can really change people's lives in a lot of ways. Now, it doesn't help people who've gotten into that downward spiral a whole lot, but it can help other people from getting there. And that's really what we're hoping to do with this. And this is going to continue. So we're hoping that this project continues on. It's not a one-off kind of thing. But what I point out in that article also toward the end is that in Jesus' time, and this is the scripture part of it, when he says he comes to proclaim liberty to captives and to set prisoners free, we have to remind ourselves that people who were imprisoned in the time of Jesus were not incarcerated because they broke a law, like, it wasn't an incarceration system like we experience it. Prisons in the time of Jesus were debtors' prisons. So really what we are doing is exactly what the gospel proclaims. We are liberating people from prison. And it's only, in a sense, metaphorical for us, in the sense that we don't send people to prison for debt anymore, but they are captive to this. And when we think about it in systemic terms, they are held captive to this whole process. And so consequently, I think it is a liberation day in very, very many ways. And so it's a grand celebration that we have for that very reason. And it is a day of Jubilee. And so in that sense, it is very much proclaiming a year of the Lord's favor. So I really, really heartily hope that people will kind of, latch on to that and see this as something of fulfilling part of the mission of St. Luke's and the church in general, of course, but St. Luke's in particular, and hopefully we will go forward with that. Anyway, so that's what's happening a week from this coming Sunday. But this Sunday is and there's a reason for why I'm saying that, because the lesson for this coming Sunday is it's a little bit of that, but not in such a happy tone. There's a little bit of harshness to it. So let's go there if we can. Let's see, let's do the screen share. These will be the lessons for the third Sunday in Lent, if you had a chance to look at them. And the first lesson is from Exodus 20. And it is basically the Decalogue. God spake these words. And we've been doing this as part of our Lenten liturgy. At the beginning, we do the penitential service, which is an option for us. And we recite the Decalogue before every liturgy, during every Sunday liturgy. We won't on like every Sunday, but we go, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and so on. And we just remind ourselves of these fundamental laws of God. And what we really need to remind ourselves about this particular passage, people make so much of the 10 Commandments. People want them emblazoned on public buildings and so on, is that they're not unique to Judaism, that these were really sort of taken up by the Hebrew community. They predate the Hebrew community. Archaeologists and anthropologists have been able to find various forms of these codes in other cultures as well. And when you really look at them, they're very, except for the initial commandments that talk about God, they are basic human commandments of conduct to keep order within a human community, about the preservation of life, the respect of life. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. A little bit about that. We think of adultery, we think of sexuality, but really in ancient times, adultery was not about sex, it was about property. Because marriage was about taking a wife, and women were considered one's property. So when you committed adultery with someone, in other words, a man had sexual relations with another man's wife or another man's woman, basically what you were doing was stealing something that was that other man's rightful right. In other words, you were stealing something from another man. Again, we have to remember what the status of women was in those cultures. So this was not, we have infused this in modern terms with a lot of our mores relatives to sexuality, But in germ, when we go back into its proper context, this was less about sexuality and more about property. Obviously, it's about sex, but it's also about the issue of understanding what sex was in that culture. We've talked about this a little bit before, that the biological understanding of procreation in that day was that the way in which procreation occurred was very much that of an agricultural society where one implanted a seed into a fertile field, the woman being the fertile field, the man implanting the seed. Hence, even the term we use for what the man implants is semen, which is the Latin term for seed. So, and even the terminology we use for, say, a woman who it cannot conceive, the ancient term was what?
Barren.
Barren, that like a field is barren. So, even the terminology, and we have sort of reacclimated our cultural understandings around that, but in terms of the actual understanding of the mechanics of it. So what you're doing is it's not much different than stealing somebody's literal property, taking a field from somebody and using it for your own purposes. So, for example, then if you had sexual relations with another man's wife and they became pregnant, what you essentially did was plant your seed in someone else's field. And that child was your child in another person's fertile ground. So that was sort of the transactional understanding. I need to clear my throat. I'm going to mute myself here a bit. Yeah. So that was the context of it. So when we get beyond the command relative to the divine person and the Sabbath, we're really talking about property rights, even about the parents, because there was an element of property rights even concerned there as well. So if you notice it, you can interpret just about all of them in that term. Murder was life. Adultery, steal, bearing false witness, one's reputation. You bore false witness in a trial, usually over whether or not someone did or did not do something. And then coveting, of course, is envy for someone else, what someone else possesses. So we really see that these are not as, we have to be careful not to read them with 21st century eyes sometimes. That's not to say that they don't have relevance in 21st century interpretation, but we can't get carried away with them. What they are about is good social order. That's what we have to remember. And then we can skip down to the gospel, which is, as I mentioned, something that's a little hard for us to think about. John chapter 2, at the beginning of John's gospel. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their table. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. The Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But of course, he was speaking of the temple of his own body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So, how does that impress you?
Well, he's given them a pronouncement that they can't understand. And so that they have that in them as the events unfold themselves and begin to explain themselves to what he was talking about, which didn't make sense that the first time he said it.
Right. Yeah. Anything else?
Well, I'm with George on that because my first thought was he's speaking in the same way that he spoke his parables, which were not easily understood. And he always had to explain them to the disciples. And here again, time showed what he was talking about, but it wasn't immediately obvious to them.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, when he is cleansing the temple, he is getting rid of the corrupt practices of the temple at the time. And he's also kind of sending notice to the powers that be in the temple.
Yeah.
He's acting with authority.
Yes, a lot of authority. And he's making a lot of enemies.
Oh, yeah.
This would have been in the outer courtyard of the temple, I'm assuming, because that's the largest area where people could gather and where you could actually have cattle and sheep and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's in the place where the most people would see and hear his actions, because only certain people were allowed to enter the deeper aspects of the temple.
Right.
So this would be very obvious.
Right.
And weren't the money changers there because you had to buy temple money with the coin of the realm, as it were?
Yeah.
And who knows what kind of usury was going on, but to cheat the ordinary people who are going there for religious reasons. Yeah.
There's a lot here. You're right. The area that we're speaking of is what's called in Herod's temple, the court of the Gentiles, which is very large. It's the outer precincts of the temple. So when we talk about all of this stuff going on in the temple, if we would say, look at our church, we don't have any sort of area in our church that would be like that. This would be like sort of over in the auditorium. It would be not in the worship space. This would be in the public reception area. In a much larger church building, it might be in the narthex or the public plaza outside or a very large vestibule area. It would be far away from where people actually worshiped. So this isn't as corrupting as a lot of people might think. And, I'm wondering about we immediately think of, and we have to be careful about this, and you bring a couple of points together here about the idea of having the money changers there right away. We think, well, money in the temple, that's got to be a corrupt practice. You're exactly correct. Part of it was that, again, remember, Palestine at this time is under Roman occupation. And that the coin of the realm, as it were, was either Roman coinage or Greek coinage. How many times in the gospel do we hear, the term, the use of Greek terminology for coins, drachma, or a denarii, or you hear Jesus, when he's confronted by, about the question on taxation, he says, whose head is on the coin you pay the taxes with? And they said, well, Caesar's, because you use the coins that, of the economy. You use the money, the money, or that's how we get coin of the realm. I mean, whoever has the authority to mint coinage. But strict Orthodox practice in the temple forbade Gentile money to be used to purchase what would be used for sacrifice. So you had to have someone to do the exchange. So you had to have someone whose job it was to take the Roman or Greek coinage and turn it into a shekel, which would be that's one of the coins, the Hebrew coins, that would be used then in the temple barter, the temple exchange. So, so go back to the story of, in Luke, for example, of the presentation, where Joseph and Mary journey from Nazareth with the infant, or Bethlehem, however the time frame was, to Jerusalem to do the required redemption sacrifice, because he's the firstborn son. And so, every firstborn son was to be consecrated to the Lord. I mean, that was the law. But you could keep your firstborn son rather than turn him over to the priests for a redemption sacrifice. And for the poor, the redemption sacrifice was a very modest 2 turtle doves. And so not everybody had 2 turtle doves at their disposal. So you would go to the temple and there would be somebody there who had the required sacrifice, and you would simply buy them. And then you would go into the priests and you would say, here's the redemptive sacrifice, offer this at the altar of the Lord. And you basically paid your dues and you got to keep your son. Yeah, Kathy.
But yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I want to phrase this. But was that fair to the poor?
Well,
Or,
the idea was,
I mean, because there were a lot of people who, are barely scraping by. And then you have to go and spend money to save your son. And who was benefiting from those shekels?
well, but the point was that it was a minimal sacrifice.
Well, I know it was a minimal, but it was still probably
Well, but you had to do something. That's why it's called a sacrifice. It's not a free ride. There are no free rides. Everybody has to do something.
But what happened with the money?
Well, but the money, that's what goes to what happens to the money we give in the offering plate? How many times have you heard me say, I don't care how big your offering is, but you've got to put something in.
Yeah.
I don't care if it's 2 pennies or 2 dimes or $1,000.
I
It's
guess what I'm
whatever. Go
what I'm
ahead.
questioning is who was profiting? Was the church actually, was the temple actually profiting, or were the powers that be in the church profiting?
Well, that's the question here. It's like it goes back to the issue of the tax collectors.
Yeah.
The corruption isn't in the system
No, it's in the
itself.
people that are doing it.
It's in are the people who are manipulating the system for their own benefit. But you see, that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's just throwing them all out. He's not saying anything about, you're charging them too much, or he is just, he's turning over the tables, he's throwing the animals out, he's throwing them out.
He's saying, why is it needed?
Well, we're in John, remember.
Yeah.
There's a message being sent here. Now, the question is, did he ever actually do this? Now, again, the question is this historical or a theological comment? And we're talking about John, and John is more about theology than he is about history. And notice what ends this particular passage. He talks about destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. He is saying that basically this system is over. But maybe it's not Jesus who's actually saying this. Maybe this is John saying this.
Well, by the time the John was written,
there you have it.
The diaspora was well
the temple is gone. I mean,
yeah, long gone.
John's writing this about 90. This is about 20 years after the temple had been torn down.
And the people are being heavily persecuted at the time.
Yep. So again, knowing the context of the gospel helps a bit to understand the message that the gospel writer is trying to communicate. That maybe, the question becomes, this may not be an historical act at all, but that's not the relevant question. The relevant question is, what is the gospel writer trying to communicate here? Even if it is an historical fact, what is the fact trying to communicate? And that is that the old system no longer obtains. The old system is no longer relevant. You don't need the money changers. You don't need the animal sacrifices. You don't need any of this, because you don't even need the temple, because who do you have? You have me.
I don't remember where it is, so I don't know if it's in the New Testament or if it's in the Psalm, but somewhere there's something about Jesus, God saying, I don't require your sacrifices.
Isaiah.
Oh, okay.
Well, because he's saying basically your heart's not in the right place. So sacrifice all you want, it ain't going to help anything. Because if your heart's not in the right place, you can sacrifice as many bullocks as you want. That's not what I want. They don't help me at all. They're supposed to be helping you. By giving up these things, you're supposed to be, seeing how these things you're supposed to be by self-sacrifice. In other words, it's a fancy term, is propitiatory offering. In other words, by giving up something that you own rather than, putting yourself, it's not self-immolation. You're not throwing yourself on the altar and burning yourself up. By burning up something, by giving up something and destroying it for my sake, in other words, to give it to, quote unquote, give it to God, You're saying that you're willing to give up parts of yourself. And ultimately, that's what Jesus talks about in terms of this notion of agapic love, self-giving love. That we are able, and he says, I no longer require you to do this with your property. I want you to do it with the stuff of your life, with your time, and take your money and your wealth and give it to the poor. Because ultimately, that's what the sacrifice was. The propitiatory sacrifices on the altar, parts of it went to the priests. That's what gave the priests food and their families food and all that sort of thing. But parts of it also went to the poor. That's the part we don't often hear about. But these things, they were burned up on the altar, but they were not reduced to ash. They were basically cooked on the altar, and what was left was then carved up and parceled out, partly to the priests and partly to the poor.
That was a question of mine about the priests were in a job, so how were they paid?
That's how.
And that's how they were paid.
They basically were paid in kind.
Mhm.
The Levites. See, the Levites did not have property. They were a tribe. They were a tribe of priests. So they did not have they didn't have like every other tribe was given a parcel of land. They were landless because they were the priests of the temple, theoretically. So the whole idea was that the rest of Israel went to the temple to offer sacrifice, and that's how they were sustained, was through the temple system. That's why, like in the story of the Good Samaritan, you have a Levite traveling by, because he might have been living somewhere else, but he had to take his turn in the temple, because by taking your turn in the temple, that's how you sustained your family. There was a whole system of things that we don't, not being Jews of that era or part of the temple system, the Sadducees party and all that, we don't know a whole lot about as Christians. But you really get deep into that whole culture. That was part of that whole thing. But then that's what Jesus is saying. You don't need any of this anymore because you have me. And I am paying this price. What do we have in the next chapter? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, so that to the end, that, et cetera. It's, you have John 3:16. That's what's coming in the week following. So this flows in so that it's not so much about money changers in the temple as it is about replacing the temple system. So that when we are looking at the Decalogue, really what we're talking about in some ways is replacing the Decalogue with the commandment of God to love. That's why I kind of brought up the idea that the Decalogue is primarily about property. So is there a distinction between the Old and the New Testament? In many ways, yes. The Old Testament was about bringing order to this world. Order out of chaos. That's how Genesis begins. But the New Testament is about transforming this world with the power of the Spirit, which is love. If you have to put Christianity into a nutshell, there it is. Also interesting, little snippets, I think, that are little interesting little bits of information. Notice the weapon Jesus uses.
Words are a whip.
Knotted cord.
Yeah, it's not something that's gonna, I mean, it hurts, but it's not gonna kill anybody. It's not like he picked up a sword or a knife or a lance. He didn't like reach over from one of the temple guards and take one of their weapons. He took basically a weapon of discipline.
And the same weapon that was used on him.
Oh, how interesting.
Except his had, the one that beat him had bits of metal and possibly glass embedded in the cord, but
Yeah, well, that's because the Romans, that was a whole different thing.
They have to carry it to a new degree.
Yeah.
but the comparison is there. Yeah.
And it's more of a threat. This is often cited also as a passage that justifies righteous anger. Get out of here, stop turning my father's house into a marketplace. In other words, there is a purpose for things, and when you violate the purpose, there is the possibility of righteous anger. I think it's interesting that even pacifist philosophies like Buddhism make room for anger.
But this kind of anger does not involve killing the person. It's
Hence
just,
that's my thing about the weapons, see?
yeah, so that you get away from the person who's pummeling you with the knotted cord, but you know he isn't trying to kill you. He just wants you to get out of there.
He wants your attention.
Yes, yes.
And even if the whip or the cords never touch you, like you said, there's a threat. Waving it around is going to get the cattle moving and the sheep moving without actually having to hit them. So of course it'll work with people.
And it's a demonstration of passion. Because we forget that the word compassion is a compound word. That passion is part of it. And passion can be, we can fall into passion is often has an equivalence of suffering. But suffering can be, we can suffer from joy. We can suffer from ecstasy. We can suffer negatively from pain. It's an extreme emotion, essentially. So when we talk about passion, we're talking about extreme emotion. So when we're talking about compassion, we're talking about suffering with. So we're talking about touching the soul of others in a deep way. And so we're talking about, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's kind of important. We sometimes see people who are hugely angered for whatever reason, and they want to kill the object. But here he wants to give the person that is the object of his anger, a lesson.
Mhm.
The person is to be corrected, not killed.
Yes. He wants to give insight. He wants them to open up. That's why he says, he has that little teaching, destroy this temple. You think I'm destroying your temple? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days it will be raised up. And so everybody's going, what is he talking about?
Yes.
And of course, John then, inserts his little, well, later on, the disciples understood. Again, John has the foresight of writing all of this many years after, after the fact. John doesn't have any foresight at all. Actually, John has the hindsight of being able to write it many years after the fact.
But if he was one of the witnesses and confused, then he has a perfect right to say the disciples didn't get it right away.
Yeah, well, he didn't get it either.
Well, he's not the reporter that we have with our previous lessons. He's the interpreter.
Yes.
And so that this is his crowd are people who can read, and they're educated, and they're Greeks and Romans primarily, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He is considered in at least the historiography of the disciples to be among the youngest of the disciples. And so, as the legend has it, was among the last to die, was considered to be the only one of the inner circle not to be martyred. So he died in exile, as the story goes, on the island of Patmos, and to have lived a long life. So he has had the opportunity, or so it is said, to have reflected on all of this for a very, very long time. And scholars would have reached pretty much consensus that his gospel dates from the late 1st century. So we're talking about decades after Jesus' life. So we're talking about a very well-developed reflective pattern, which is why his gospel is so convoluted in some ways. It's not a straightforward narrative at all. It's very theoretical, very theological. There's a lot of deep thinking within it, and incorporates a lot of Greek philosophy. I mean, we could go back again, as we have before, and read the prologue, the first chapter, the beginning of the first chapter, and we could spend months studying that. I mean, just the concept of the logos itself. And some scholars say that John's singular purpose is to argue against Gnosticism, which was a prevalent and prevailing heresy in the first centuries of the church, and was already in theological speak infecting the way people were thinking about Jesus. That as a member of the inner circle among the first disciples, he experienced Jesus in the flesh. And the Gnostics wanted to turn Jesus into this sort of theosoner, into this godlike figure who was uncorrupted by flesh. So he was more of a sort of spirit encased in flesh. So that's sort of Gnosticism in a nutshell too. It's much more complicated than that, but that's why he gets into this notion of the word that he uses, and the word logos became flesh, and he uses the word sarx, which means not simply that he was like a ghostly figure that sort of was like poured into a fleshly body, but actually was this thing, this body. There's another term he could have used, but he didn't. He used the word sarx. It was a very definite choice. And so there are, Johannine scholars all through, when you read the Gospel of John, you read the letters and you read Revelation, that this was his singular purpose, was to argue against the Gnostics. And of course, there are those who say the last two letters of John were not written by John at all, but by his followers. And some now even doubt if the first letter was written by him. But very much of what's called the Johannine school. People who are very much of the mind of John.
In medicine, we use the word sark also.
Yeah.
And it refers to flesh.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the Greek term for that. I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why a sarcophagus, is the box that holds the body. And there's a certain characteristic to a sarcophagus. And it's usually decorated in a certain way and so on, because it has an identity to it. It's not just simply a generic coffin. So that's why he uses that term sarx, because there's an identity to Jesus' body, not just a generic vessel, which is kind of what the Gnostics would say. He didn't matter what body he had, it wasn't his identity. And John says, oh, no. So that when we get this idea of John, when we start looking at John from the beginning, even this is, part of the polemic that he has against the Gnostics. So just manifesting this anger, which is a very human trait. So in his gospel, you'll see that Jesus has all these various emotions and does all these different things. Because even though he might be very equanimous most of the time, he has these very passionate moments.
And John was not getting a lot of information secondhand.
No.
So who would know better?
Unlike Mark, Mark is thought to have been Peter's secretary. I mean, that's kind of the way it's thought, that Mark was the one who was the literate one, Peter being just an illiterate fisherman. And so it's thought that Mark was the one who, could actually read and write, and so wrote down Peter's thoughts and Peter's stories. Because Mark wrote in Greek, and Peter, if Peter could speak anything, it was probably Aramaic. That's when we get into those kind of scholarly conversations. And that's why it's one of the earliest gospels.
John mulled over what he was going to put down for a
for a long time, and again, because he was, and he was, the whole story about being entrusted with Jesus' mother and all of that stuff. There's a there's a whole lot that goes with this that we don't really think about very often. That, he was, so that we're kind of getting off into a sort of rabbit hole on this, but there's this story is unique in this particular context. But then, again, taking in a liturgical context, we get it this week, and it's next week that we get the story, where Jesus meets with Nicodemus, and then suddenly, we don't get the whole Spirit conversation. That's in year A, but we get the John 3:16 passage next week.
Oh.
So we're introduced to this notion of the resurrection, the sort of prediction of the resurrection: destroy this body, and in 3 days we will raise it up. And then John has this little commentary. Oh, the disciples didn't get it either, but afterwards they got it. And then next week we get this notion that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, so that those who would believe in him would have eternal life. We get that next week on Laetare Sunday. So, part of the liturgical context as we journey through Lent helps us with the interpretation of what we're looking at. Anything else strike you about this particular lesson? I've always been puzzled by that notion: zeal for your house consumes me. What does that mean? It's just sort of like it's just plopped in there.
Well, that's a mighty strong sentence.
It is.
And it's an indication, I would guess, of his humanity, rather than being a passive, wonderful figure that things do get to him, so to speak.
Mhm.
And that's a very human trait.
Yeah. Good. Kathy, you're thinking. I can see that.
It's always dangerous when I start thinking.
Yeah, well, put us in danger.
Okay. I think when he talks about zeal for his father's house, he's talking, and I don't think he's talking in the present tense. It's zeal for what is to come. As we were talking about, the old way is destroyed, the new way is coming. And that zeal is a zest for living the Father's will.
I think it's interesting that it says his disciples remembered.
Yeah.
There's a footnote in my Bible, if I can read it here, to Psalm 69, and it says, see Zechariah 14:21, Malachi 3:1. So those older references, is that what the disciples would be hearing or thinking about?
Mm-hmm.
Because they would have known the old writings.
Yeah, they're thinking on, again, fulfillment of prophecy here. We all know people who get like this. It's like the concept of zeal in zealotry. We often think of zealots as being sort of in a negative term. Oh, he's just a zealot.
Yeah.
How often you've heard that, and it's usually a put down.
Yeah.
He's just a zealot, They just kind of like they're way too far into this, it's like, and it's because of that. I mean, even that phrase, zeal consumes. It's when somebody's for a cause, and it's almost all that person can think about.
But it's kind of like this bright flame that burns very brightly for a while and then dies out.
Well, I don't know.
I'm not saying I'm saying it ends up consuming its, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying it's, it burns so brightly and so hot and so intense that it can only do that
For so long.
for so long.
But isn't that what the zealots of Jesus' time were thinking, that the Messiah would be, that he would be this fire that destroys the Roman occupation, that they would be, a free and independent state?
Oh yeah.
Well, that's why they were called zealots.
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't the kind of zealot that they had hoped he would be.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them was his disciples.
Right.
Some say that was Judas Iscariot's downfall. He was not identified in the scriptures as a zealot, but some conjecture that was what was behind his betrayal, was he was trying to force Jesus into this position of self-preservation, because he would have thought of himself, if he was Jesus, he would preserve himself by calling down the powers that he felt Jesus had for self-preservation, but then was surprised that Jesus did not.
Could that be reflected in the mobs that were calling for Jesus' crucifixion because he did not turn out to be what they wanted?
Possibly.
Often, we will turn on a dime against somebody if they aren't what we expect them to be. Just a thought.
No, but that's a very good thought. I mean, now we're getting somewhere in that sense of, this isn't all as people, we wouldn't be so different if we were there. Do the Walter Cronkite thing for a moment. You are there. I know this is an age group I can say that to.
Not Kathy.
No, wait, no, I remember Walter Cronkite very well.
Yeah,
Okay,
and that series, of course, is older than most of us, but I remember watching it as a kid. The reruns of you were there. It's the historical thing. But to put yourself into that. I mean, this is a prayer thing that I do. With Ignatian meditation on plays. Go there. Be in the procession on Palm Sunday. Get caught up in the dynamics of the crowd. Think of the last time you saw someone that you just thought was the best thing since mayonnaise. And then they turned out to be not quite who they thought you thought they were, and what you felt, and how disappointed you were. And now they've been revealed as being, well, less than noble. And somebody is whipping up the crowd against them. And you're in this mass crowd, and suddenly the mob takes over again. It's not so hard. And we tend to think too, we forget, the mobs were not as big as they are in the Cecil B. DeMille productions. these were mobs of, maybe 100 people or more. They weren't these massive thousands of people because they just didn't exist in these cities. But in fact, the Romans wouldn't have allowed that. I mean, first of all, there weren't that many people, but if there were, that would have been out of control. But even they wouldn't have fit into the Praetorium, where the crucify him took place. I mean, it's not that big. There probably, if there was 100 people there, it was a lot. But yeah, if you were there, and this is somebody you had placed your hopes in, and they bring him out, and he looks like this beat up wimp. And you realize, oh God,
He won't even speak up for himself. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, crucify him. What the hell do I care?
And if people are feeling, if they're really high on energy and what have you, and the mob mentality takes over, it doesn't take too long before
No.
they're crying for whatever has been instigated.
Right. And then you walk by him, he's outside the city and he's on the cross, and you go like, yeah, you said you could save, you were going to tear the temple down. Go ahead. Look at you. It's not so hard to think of ourselves doing these kinds of things. You made such a fuss. You got Pilate mad at us now. Now our kids are going to suffer. He's going to be mad at us, and he's going to now he's got a curfew. All those kinds of things. When you stop to think about these things, you go like, oh, there, but for the grace of God, go I. So, so let's put ourselves into this lesson and see him. You're there with your 2, shekels. You're just about ready to buy a turtle dove because you want to redeem your firstborn son. And he just chased everybody out of the temple. And you're going like, now what do we do? And you're going like, who do you think you are? I came all the way from Galilee for this. I took a day off from work. I can't afford to do this. And now, what am I going to do? The birds are all flying all over the place.
More than a day off, probably a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, a couple of days at least.
Yeah,
Not that far, but
yeah. Well,
but
especially if you stayed out of Samaria.
It's a trip,
Yeah.
So something to think about. Well, as I said, speaking of shekels and drachmas, I have to go see I have to go ready to see Matthew.
Well, hopefully they won't get too many out of you.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, we'll see you next week. Thank you
Yep.
so much. Take care. Have a good week.
Yep. Bye-bye.